Shabbat Shalom, and thank you for honoring me by inviting me to speak with you on this Trans Day of Visibility. And thank you for holding up the trans community by observing Trans Day of Visibility, particularly at this time when trans people are under attack around the country and really around the world. Um, For me, trans identity has always been intertwined with my Jewish identity. Both were ways that I've known I was different from the people around me as long as I can remember. But my trans identity was a difference that I grew up feeling was both shameful and wrong, but also really dangerous. That if I revealed who I was, if I was visible to my family, to my friends, to my community, um, I would be seen as monstrous or unlovable and be expelled or possibly worse. So I consciously lived in hiding um, and and believed that my life depended on maintaining my cover and passing as the boy everybody thought I was. But my parents, particularly my mother, was proudly Jewish. She'd grown up in the Montreal ghetto and been subjected to intense anti-Semitism. And she believed that she was not religious, particularly, but she believed that it was important that her children be raised to be visibly Jewish, to know that they were different and to be open and proud about and proud of that difference. And so my Jewish identity actually taught me how to be an openly trans person, how to be visible as a trans person. When I started living as myself in my mid 40s, I had no experiences of being visibly trans, but I had a lot of experience in being visibly and proudly Jewish. I had no experience of my trans identity connecting me to other people. I thought of it as only something that separated me from other people. But my Jewish identity told me that being different can also be a way of connecting to people in the present, to people around the world, to people you'll never meet, to a past, and to a future. All things that trans people, when I was growing up, and really trans people today, I think few of us have that sense when we're growing up. So when I started writing poetry, um, which I began doing at a very, in grade school, I was extremely conscious of these two differences. And I knew that I couldn't write poems and show them to anybody if they were about my trans identity, if they might out me. Um, but I wanted to write poems that were openly Jewish, particularly poems drawn on the Torah and um, on the Holocaust. And but I worried about that. I thought, well, I remember I'm like 8 or 9 years old. I'm thinking, well, but I'll lose audience members if I'm visibly Jewish in my poetry this way, right? Of course, I did not have an audience then, but I'm like thinking, what if people don't get the references? So being visibly Jewish enabled me to wrestle with questions that minority writers and artists struggle with all the time, which is how much to make ways that you're different part of your art, how much to foreground it. And it gave me practice in doing that. And when I um, tried to use poetry to write things about being trans, I often coded them and hid them in poems that seemed to be only about Jewish subjects. For example, the first poem in my first book, Rabbi Jose the Angel, is about a rabbi who's born with wings, who's visibly different and has wings. So to me, I knew that that was about the way that I felt about being trans, but here was a hero who was not hiding their difference. But for everybody else, it was just a poem about being Jewish, a Jewish guy, miraculous legend, whatever. This is another more personal example. It's called wrestling. Um, for both Jews and trans people, the story of the Torah that this draws on, which is the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel, both Jews and trans people recognize that as a story about transition. It's a story about becoming a new version of yourself. Jacob goes through this and he gets another name and really another destiny. He gets the name Israel. Um, and trans people going through transition, of course, often come out with different names, different destinies. And like many trans people, before Jacob makes this transition, he has to separate himself from the life that he has. He sends his family and everything that he owns across the river, and he stays alone. We don't know why he does that. While he's alone, he encounters a stranger. It seems to be an angel, and he wrestles all night, and he can't win. He can't defeat the angel, but he holds on until dawn when the angel needs to leave, and that's how Jacob wins. And I think that's a lot of how trans people win. we just we hang on even in against a world that is always trying to defeat us and wound us, a world we know we can't win over, but we can fight to a draw, and in that fight we become who we really are and create a new future for ourselves. When I wrote this poem, that was explicitly, it's about me and my father, and I think you'll hear that. Wrestling. You wish you'd stayed on your family's side. Not that you're losing, not at all. The angel's wings snap in the vice of your thighs. The angel gropes, searching out the sinew of light, the blessing you stole in disguise from a father who could only love what he couldn't recognize. The angel threatens to kill, to die, claims to be your father's God, your father himself, abashed and blind, the fear that took his eyes. You wish you could let him go, lose to keep him alive. Dissolving in the breaking light, he begs you to let him fly, his feathers melting, running down your thigh. So to me, this was mostly about this ambivalent relationship with my father, wanting to hold on, wanting to let go. But I snuck in things about my trans experience, a father who could only love what he couldn't recognize. That was true in my case of my father. My father could only love me as the boy he thought I was, not as who I really was. Um, After I came out and was living as myself, I found to my surprise that the meaning of the poem completely changed. Now that I was visible as a trans person, it started to be read as a poem about trans identity, as though the angel that I'm wrestling with is this old male self that I can't let go of and I can't hang on to, and this very difficult part of transition, or maybe about queerness in general. Um, and so it's astonishing to me the way that becoming visible as a trans person is actually given new and different meaning to my work. When I was growing up, every time I said I to someone, like if I said to my mother, I'm hungry, I knew that no matter how true what I was saying was, it was also partly a lie, because the people I was talking to would think I meant the boy that they thought that I was, and I knew that I was someone else. The only time that I said I and knew that the person understood who I meant by I was when I talked with God, which I did a whole lot, since God was the only one who really knew who I was. Um, After transition, when I was before transition, I wrote a lot of poems like Wrestling, which they're personal without being personal. They're in the voice of somebody else, a character, or they're so oblique, nobody can tell what I'm really saying about myself because I had to hide who I was. So after transition, I thought, well, now I can just write poems in the first person, and it'll be so much easier than the crazy displacement that I was doing before. But I found I couldn't because I didn't know who I meant by I. I hadn't grown into myself enough to know who I was. And so I wrote a lot of poems in the second person addressed to a you, but like wrestling is. Um, but I realized that I wanted to write psalms, like David's kind of catchy psalms. And as I started writing them, I realized I can say I in these poems. Because I've always said I to God, and God has always known what it meant. So I don't need to know who I'm becoming in order to speak in the first person in these poems. And this is one from my book of Psalms. Um, the you in the poem is God, and the me is actually the real autobiographical me. It's time the soul you planted in the soil of this unhappy body learned to love you without scratching, to recognize and melt beneath the kisses you disguise as bitterness and licorice whips and galaxies of glimmering suns dangling in drops from dripping leaves. It's time for you to plant me among your dripping leaves, and time for me to glimmer there in ecstasy. Time for you to make me an instrument of your beauty, and time for me to play the music of you that can only be made of and through the holes you make in me. I think it's not a coincidence that when I'm speaking to God and saying I in this way, it's also the first time that I'm embracing the sense of brokenness that I had as a trans person. You know, we transition in middle age. There are all of these ways that your body is never going to match your gender identification. And I felt those as failures and brokenness, and it was hard for me to live with. But as you can see in that poem, the speaker is saying to God, use what's broken in me so that I can make music, the music of you. That fusion of trans experience and Jewish tradition, right? Because I learned to write psalms from the examples in the Torah. And but that poem and really the entire book is infused with this trans experience, starting when I was a kid, of being alone with God and just really being able to talk about the hard stuff directly with God. Um, that was something that has become a huge part of my post-transition life as a poet. And but I've moved from the very personal focus of Psalms to looking for ways that the combination of my trans experiences and identity and Jewish tradition can create kinds of language that really can speak to everyone, which is, of course, what the Torah is mostly trying to do. So I wrote a series of adaptations of texts. This is an adaptation of Psalm 118 for a sequence called Gender Isn't the Only Transition, because I realized, people are changing all the time and going through these processes. And each poem is in the voice of a different aspect of transition. It's what that aspect of transition says to us. This one is called My Voice is the Voice of Becoming. I know I'm pushing you hard. Despair and bitterness swarm you like bees. I hear you crying out to God, and I hear God answer, shouting the love that is your future, prying open your lids. God hurts you. God swarms you. God's right hand lifts you up and pushes you down again. But God won't give you up for dead. Your life is a day that God has made. God has unlocked the lies you told yourself were you. They have become the gates of truth. God is leading you through. I'd like to finish with a poem from my most recent book. It came out last year. It's called Shekhinah Speaks. And in this poem, These are first-person poems, but the speaker is not me, but in some way is me. The speaker of these poems is the Shekhinah. The goal of the poems was actually to create language through which Shekhinah could speak, since she doesn't speak in our tradition. And I found as the poems grew that the Shekhinah in every poem is talking to a singular human you, by which she means everyone. Shekhinah is the immanent part of God, the female aspect of divinity that's with each one of us individually, that experiences what we experience and feels what we feel, and is always there, but that we're normally not aware of. And this Shekhinah wants us to be aware of her. And as I tuned into her voice, I found that a lot of the poems were talking about the obstacles in us that were keeping us from knowing that she's there, but more importantly, from seeing ourselves the way that she sees us. This poem is very much like that, and it's about an obstacle in us that is often a huge aspect of trans and LGBTQ plus experience. The poem is called Shame. So remember, the Shekhinah is talking individually to you about you. Shame. Ashamed of what you are and aren't, you struggle to stay connected, part of the family, part of the future, part of the culture that sometimes makes you feel like a monster, telling yourself you're the opposite of brave, that whatever you are is the opposite of what I meant to make. How dare you question what I create? Your shame and your panic, your sex and your rage, where you're broken and where you break. I bore them, I bear them. I open the gates of privilege and stigma so even you can see the image, my image, in which you are created. You can hide from everyone, child, but you can't hide from me. I'm your calamity and your queen, the truth from which there's no protection, the heaven that stretches equally over victory and shame. I foretold you long ago, declared to the ends of the earth, I would be your potter, and you would be my clay, a storehouse I'd fill with treasure, a habitation for my name, matter fashioned into revelation, a cloud from which I reign. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.